Good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Silvers Annual Lecture on Holocaust, Genocide, and Contemporary Bioethics. My name is Josh Rager. I'm a faculty member at the Center for Bioethics and assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at the IU School of Medicine. Funding for this lectureship was provided by Dr. William S. Silvers, a graduate of the IU School of Medicine and a faculty member for over 30 years at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. The purpose of the Silvers Lectureship is to offer space annually for healthcare professionals, students, and others throughout our community to consider the lessons of the Holocaust and other cases of genocide for practicing medicine and conducting research. This lectureship strives to help healthcare professionals reflect on the morality of their actions and to ground contemporary conflicts in the lessons of history. The IU Center for Bioethics has been proud to host this lecture for the last 5 years, and the Center for Bioethics at University of Colorado has hosted a similar series for some time before that, all due to the work of Dr. Silvers and his collaborators. Dr. Silvers is a passionate and persistent voice for remembering history and applying it to our everyday life. I was first introduced to Dr. Silvers as a fourth-year medical student here at IU for the inaugural Silvers Lectureship. I just spent some of my summer in Poland and Germany as a part of a program called the Fellowships at Auschwitz for the study of professional ethics, where I, along with other medical students, consider the key and horrific roles that healthcare professionals played in the Holocaust and Nazi regime. During that fellowship, we talked a lot about memorials, what a good memorial is, what it means, its significance. And this was often in the context of being physically at one in Europe, some structure or site we were visiting. What struck me during the inaugural Silvers Lectureship in 2019, something I hadn't realized prior, is that I had a very narrow conception of what memorial was and is and could be. But in fact, a memorial doesn't have to be made of stone or concrete or have a physical address or a plaque. But it can be living, active, and dynamic, an auditorium of people, ideas, and discussion. And the Silvers Lectureship made me realize this because it is that kind of special memorial, one that we now get the opportunity to participate in today, to be present for the next hour or so, in the midst of our busy lives in a chaotic world. So thank you, Dr. Silvers, for this. Today's speaker is a perfect person to present this lecture. Dr. Amber Comer is one of our own. She's an affiliate faculty member at the Center for Bioethics, an associate professor of health sciences and medicine in the schools of health and human sciences, as well as medicine and the School of Law. She serves on the board of trustees for the International Neuropalliative Care Society and is the director of the ethics policy and secretary of the Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs at the American Medical Association. In this role, she has acted as the ethics consultant to the World Medical Association, and as a part of this work, we'll soon have a publication in the Lancet, breaking news. At the AMA and in other settings, Dr. Comer has been involved in ethics education and reflection on the history of the Holocaust, reflecting her deep personal and professional interest in this topic. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Comer.
Well, hi, everybody. It is so wonderful to be here. And speaking of being one of our own, we actually had a class together back when we were students like 15 years ago, which was wild. And we haven't seen each other since. So thank you all for being here for this very important topic and this very important discussion. So I just want to start, if I can figure out how to make the clicker work. There we go. Okay, we're on board. That I don't have any conflicts of interest, but these views are my own. They are not the views of Indiana University or the American Medical Association. There's my legal disclaimer. Let's go. Okay, so I want to start by telling you guys this quote from Aristotle, which I think is really going to set the tone and the tenor for this lecture. Aristotle said, "It's the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it." And this is something that I would like you to reflect upon and think about during my entire lecture. I also want to tell you that we are going to talk about some really difficult things that happened a long time ago, and things that happened not so long ago, and things that happened not so very far away from where all of us are sitting today. And so keep that in mind as we talk. Nothing I say or show you is a justification for any of the atrocities that happened. I'm merely trying to understand what happened and help you understand what happened so that we truly can never allow this to happen again. So we're going to start by talking about the Holocaust. Adolf Hitler, this person in the middle, he assumed power on January 30th, 1933. And at the time that he assumed power in Germany, Germany was really struggling with a defeat from World War I. And it left the country in chaos. And during Hitler's first radio address after becoming chancellor, he outlined his goals for Germany as follows: restoring national unity and order, addressing unemployment and food shortage, and restoring the economy, and to restore Germany as a world power. So he started with goals which didn't seem too far from what we hear our own politicians say. And yet, over the course of his 12 years in power, he dismantled democracy, and he started, implemented, and completed the systematic displacement, enslavement, torture, and murder of millions of innocent people. He forced people into ghettos with deplorable living conditions. They were transported in cattle cars, and they were treated worse than animals. The concept, or this terrible atrocity, I should say, that occurred is known as the Holocaust, which is the systematic state-sponsored genocide of 6 million Jewish persons and millions of others between 1933 and 1945. And these unspeakable horrors occurred within Germany, Poland, and Europe. But we're also going to talk about the parallels of what happened here in America during the same time. But first, I want to talk about some of the atrocities that happened in these concentration camps, known as the Nazi medical experiments. So the Nazi medical experiments were torture and murder under the guise of science. They were performed on healthy persons without consent, without regard to pain or suffering, and without regard to the life or death of the person. Eva Moses Kor, who is a Holocaust survivor, whose son is actually here with us in the audience and gave this lecture several years ago, in her own words, she was a part of these experiments, and we will talk more about her later. But she said, quote, "We were guinea pigs in a laboratory that was hell on earth. There were no limits to what they would do. They did not see us as human beings." So I just want to go through some of the experiments, and I will tell you, I'm not going to go into deep depth in the experiments because we have so much more to learn and so many other things to talk about. And this is not all of the experiments, it's just a highlight. So there was the freezing and hypothermia experiments where prisoners were submerged in ice water or left in freezing outdoor conditions. They were left until they died, and they timed how long it would take for these persons to die. And in one report, it states that in 7 experiments, the victims died at 53 to 106 minutes after the start of cooling. Think about having to end your life being frozen to death. No one asked them for consent. Nobody asked them if they wanted to participate. There were the high altitude experiments where victims were placed in low pressure chambers simulating altitudes up to 20,000 meters. They were also left to die. There were infectious disease and vaccine studies where subjects were deliberately infected with disease and given experimental treatments, or not given treatments at all. There was high mortality and extreme suffering. These are some of the most atrocious, I think, to think about is the bone, muscle, and joint transplantation experiments where people had limbs, muscles, and joints taken from their bodies without anesthesia in an attempt to try to transplant them on other persons. Obviously, it didn't work and these people died. Then there were the twin studies. The twin studies occurred from 1943 to 1945 under Joseph Mengele. And during the Nuremberg doctor trials, Dr. Karl Gebhardt, who was a part of this, admitted in his testimony, quote, "We performed these operations to test new treatments. They were done without anesthesia. The patients were not informed. and could not consent. They were treated as material. That's the words of a doctor testifying to his atrocious part in these experiments. This is Dr. Joseph Mengele, and he is known as the Angel of Death. Dr. Mengele supervised the selection of Auschwitz incoming prisoners and determined whether the prisoner was deemed fit for torturous labor or immediate extermination. And he would famously shout left or right, pointing to direct people to their fates. He was also responsible for the twin studies, where he experimented on countless live Jewish prisoners under the guise of medical treatment, often with the goal of death. Most unfortunately, Dr. Mengele actually escaped justice and lived the rest of his life out in South America and was never brought to justice. This is Eva Kor, who I mentioned earlier. She started the Candles Holocaust Museum in Terre Haute, Indiana, and I highly recommend, if you are in the area, that you stop by and you visit. I'm going to read Eva Kor's own words from an interview about what happened to her during the twin experiments. Because we were twins, we were used in a variety of experiments. 3 times a week, we'd be placed naked in a room for 6 to 8 hours to be measured and studied. It was unbelievably demeaning. After an experimental injection, Eva developed a high fever, and she recalled, quote, Dr. Mengele came in the next day. He looked at my fever chart and declared that I had only 2 weeks left to live. For 2 weeks, I was between life and death, but I refused to die. If I had died, Mengele would have given Miriam, that's her twin sister, a lethal injection in order to do a double autopsy. When I didn't die, he carried on experimenting with us. Eventually, at the end of the war, there were the Nuremberg doctor trials, which became very famous because of the Nuremberg Code. And the Nuremberg doctor trials only tried 23 persons, 20 of whom were physicians and 3 of whom were staff that worked with these physicians. Brigadier General Telford Taylor, in his opening statement at the Nuremberg doctor trials, stated, the defendants in this case are charged with murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. The victims of these crimes are numbered in the hundreds of thousands. They were slaughtered outright or died in the course of the tortures to which they were subjected. The question that I want to talk about today is, how did we get here? Many wonderful scholars who are much more brilliant in the subjects of the Nazi medical experiments have published a lot of work on them, and I do highly encourage you to read it. Today, we're going to talk about, how did we get to the Nazi medical experiments? Was it because these doctors had no ethics? That is a common thing people think. Nazis had no ethics. They forgot about the Hippocratic Oath. Well, in order to understand, we have to go back in time. So we're going to travel back in time to the 1800s, and we're going to talk about this concept of social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is the belief that Darwin's theory of natural selection and the concept of survival of the fittest applies to human societies, politics, and economies. I will tell you that today, as we sit here, this is pseudoscience. We absolutely know it has been debunked. We know that it is not scientifically correct. However, back in the 1800s, that was not the case. And so we're going to talk about how science can sometimes get it wrong, and people can sometimes entertain a thought and accept it, even when maybe they shouldn't. So in 1859, Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species. And I will tell you that the theory of evolution, which is separate from social Darwinism, is in fact an accepted scientific theory that we do still teach. And as you know, there are many conversations in state legislatures today about whether or not this scientific theory should even be taught, because it's usually Darwin's theory of evolution versus creationism, which is the idea or concept that God created humans. So there's nothing in and of itself wrong with Charles Darwin's publication of Origin of the Species. What happened came from the philosophers and the scientists who misinterpreted or reinterpreted what this meant for society and for science and philosophy and for ethics. So this is Herbert Spencer. In 1864, he took Darwin's theory and he stated, the survival of the fittest, which I have here sought to express in mechanical terms, is that which Mr. Darwin has called natural selection. So I'm sure you've all heard survival of the fittest. And now you know where this origin comes from. It comes from Herbert Spencer, where he's taking Darwin's work of natural selection and he starts touting this theory of survival of the fittest. So far, not so bad. Let's see what happens with that. Then we get to 1868 with Ernest Haeckel, and he used social Darwinism to argue that human races evolved at different rates, and therefore some races are more primitive because they are closer to apes. He said the lowest species of men, the Vendas and the Australians, are perhaps more closely related to the anthropod apes than to civilized European. Now we have taken Darwinism, created social Darwinism, and now we've used it to scientifically try to uphold horrific racist ideas and concepts. Charles Darwin, who again was not a part of the social Darwinist movement, but was a scientist who published on evolution, then publishes The Descent of Man in 1871. And he states, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. In comes Francis Galton. This is actually Darwin's cousin. So Francis Galton then terms the phrase eugenics, which if you have not heard about it, I hope you, if you leave anything from this lecture, it's that you understand that eugenics started here, and we'll talk about that. By here, I mean literally across the street from where we're sitting, and that we did play a role in what happened to the people during the atrocities of the Holocaust. Francis Galton said, what nature does blindly, slowly, and ruthlessly, man may do providentially, quickly, and kindly. And I should say that neither Darwin nor Galton were advocating for eugenics to be used in the way that it eventually was. But these are the theories behind how philosophy and ethics started to be questioned. I'll tell you, when Darwin published his work, it changed everything. It threw philosophy, ethics, and science into an invariable crises, existential crises, where we started to question everything we had ever known. If God didn't create us, if we just evolved from animals, does that mean that we have rights outside of animals? Are we better than animals? Do humans even have rights? These were the questions that people started to ask after Darwin published his work. And I will tell you that these questions were then picked up by people like Alexander Till, who then blended Nietzsche's philosophy. Do you all remember Nietzsche, God is dead? He blended Nietzsche's philosophy with Darwin's theory of evolution and argued for profound new ethics, which challenged traditional moral frameworks. Then we get to 1900, where there was the Crump Prize competition, and the official purpose was to determine the scientific truth of Darwin's theory of evolution and its implications for human society. What does this mean that we evolved from animals and not necessarily from a creator? So the winning book was by William Schallmeyer, and he said in his book, The View, Darwinism, had an especially powerful influence on ethics. It led not only to new views about the origin and evolution of ethical commands, and thus to new foundations for them, but also led to the demand for a partial alternation of the present valid ethical views. Now we are charting to challenge the ethical moorings that have held medicine for millennia. We then get to 1904, the St. Louis World's Fair and the 1906 Bronx Zoo exhibits, where Oda Benga was a very young teenager. He was actually taken from his tribe in an African village. He was sold and then brought to the St. Louis World's Fair and the Bronx Zoo, where he was put into a living exhibit with orangutans and apes. I don't exactly know all the details, I wasn't there, but he was brought into the, to live with these so that he could show that there were species that were more closely evolved to apes than to humans. Absolutely horrific. This poor child, because he was a child, eventually ended up committing suicide because of the denigration of his human rights that he experienced while he was put into an actual zoo. So we get to 1920 and we have Carl Binding and Alfred Hoche, and they term the phrase life unworthy of life. And their paper, where they have now taken the scientific theory of Darwinism, they have now combined it with this theory of social Darwinism, We are now starting to argue that ethically and morally, we are on the brink of extinction as a species. And something must be done. And that is, there are lives that are unworthy of life. And so the question is whether there are human lives whose continued existence has permanently lost all value for both the bearer of the life and for society. So social Darwinists started to thrive because they built on people's fears. They capitalized on this concept that we were facing extinction. So fears of social Darwinists moved into a new view of ethics, that ethics are relative, meaning they don't come from the nature or the divine, that if humans can evolve from other animals, why do we think that we have unique dignity? And if we don't have unique dignity, do human rights even exist? And if human rights don't exist, and it's all about survival of the species and survival of the fittest, then maybe there are lives that aren't worth living. Natural selection shows that survival of the fittest is the law of nature. These were the thoughts and the fears and the theories that drove social Darwinism, and they were all based on science. The laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit. The human life is valuable only when it is of use to the community or race. This was by Madison Grant, an American lawyer. Enter eugenics. So social Darwinism evolved into eugenics. They took what they thought was a scientific theory and they turned it into something that is going to end in the Holocaust. So the original social Darwinists, I've told you, Herbert Spencer, they believed in non-interference. But then we started to think, why not interfere? If science shows us that if we interfere, and think about dogs and chickens and cows, if we can breed them and we can breed the strongest horse that we can race because we breed two really strong racehorses, why wouldn't that work with humans? And why would we leave evolution to chance when science can guide it? So eugenics is the program of trying to improve the race by inducing young people to make a more reasonable selection of marriage. They wanted them to fall in love intelligently. Eugenics started with this concept that maybe we should just not breed if we're not the fittest. So enter the very first eugenics law, which happened in 1907 in Indianapolis, Indiana, literally across the street at the State House from where we are all sitting now. This was the first eugenics law, not Nazi Germany, Indianapolis, Indiana. And this law came from, in part from research that was done from a pastor from Indianapolis on the tribe of Ishmael, where they claimed that there were these people who were paupers and beggars and thieves and criminals and prostitutes and wanderers. And my goodness, Indiana just could not take any of these people possibly breeding, because guess what was going to happen? We were all going to become that way eventually, because those who were degenerates were breeding at much faster rates than people who were fit and should be breeding. So Indiana passed the first eugenics law. In 1910, a National American Eugenics Record Office was opened. This eugenics office actually collected data about eugenics, looking for deficiencies and disabilities in people's histories, and they stored these records. This is a eugenics demonstration on Wall Street in 1950, which 15, I'm sorry, which I think that these slides really help show what the eugenicists were worried about. They said, I cannot read the sign, but what right have I, children? I must drink alcohol to sustain life. Shall I transfer the cravings to others? Would the prisons, asylums be filled if my kind had no children? Enter the American Eugenics Society. This one's, the American Eugenics Society was opened in 1926, and it was actually funded by the Carnegie Foundation, which was actually a top-notch scientific grant funding organization, which really gave it a lot of value to people. The American Eugenics Society hosted different types of contests for fitter babies and fittest families. They published pamphlets, and they engaged in public outreach and propaganda to promote and advocate for eugenics in America. The Eugenics Society of America's mission was to improve the genetic quality of the human population. I'm not going to read everything on the slide. This is just to show you that this concept of eugenics was they considered evidence-based at the time. Yes, of course, there were people who spoke out and said that it wasn't. But in the New England Journal of Medicine, this is just a sampling of articles that were published in New England Journal saying statistics would seem to show that eugenics foresee an inevitable gradual deterioration of the human race. It is inevitable that in the course of time, eugenics laws restricting the marriage of the unfit will be enacted, though to what extent it is impossible to present to see. Statistical inquiries seem to justify that society is not just generally denigrating, and that places to being prevent work can be chosen scientifically. They're using science to argue eugenics. So what I'm presenting to you here on the right, your left, is this was published in a pamphlet from the American Eugenics Society, and it actually shows a flourishing family tree full of fit people. And over there, you can see the degradation of humanity when mentally defective people procreate. On your right, my left, you're going to see as a chart from Nazi Germany that shows who is determined to be a Jew. And you can see what you're starting to see now is maybe there are parallels between what the Nazis did and what America did. All of this was, in their view, based on science. Again, we now know it's pseudoscience, but at the time, that is really not what they thought. So we get to 1924, and Harry H. Laughlin testifies before Congress in support of immigration restriction. He says, "The science of eugenics is not a theory. It is a science of practical application." They pass this immigration law. This immigration law bans people who are considered imbeciles, morons, homosexuals, anyone who is considered degenerate from immigrating into the United States. And among that, they start to decide that entire groups of persons can't immigrate. What's even more, I think, how do I say this, outrageous, is that in 1924, the United States of the Supreme Court of America in Buck versus Bell upheld forced sterilization in the United States. And it produced an infamous quote by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, where he said that we should be able to engage in forced eugenics because, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, end quote. 1924. When did I say Hitler came to power? We did it first. So the Nazis adopted, applied, and weaponized the concepts of social Darwinism and eugenics. They came to this concept of racial hygiene. They were obsessed with the concept of racial hygiene, in which the core tenets were a belief that there was a struggle for survival among the races, and the strong had a moral duty to dominate the weak. So enter a shift in ethical thinking, a shift from thinking that humans, all humans, regardless of who you are and where you are from, have intrinsic moral value. The Germans believed that Aryans were the biological pinnacle of humanity and that Jews were a threat to German racial purity and survival. Racial hygiene encompassed a shift away from these values that we hold dear today and started down a path that would forever change humanity. The Nazis justified the step towards eugenics by estimating their own ultimate demise. They estimated that by the year 2000, the Volk, that's the German community, would only consist of 47 million people and that they would be well on their way to extinction. A quote from a Nazi ethicist, quote, "It appeared as though the German Volk had been encumbered with an unremovable burden of death," end quote. They feared for racial extinction. And just so you know, I did look up how many racially ethnic Germans there were in 2000, and this did not come to fruition even after everything that happened with World War II. So their math wasn't mathing. So when we have the concept of racial purity, and so the Germans start pushing this concept, racial purity. And what you see here is propaganda from the Nazis, where on the one side you have the translation in essence says that this individual costs the Volk, the community, 60,000 Reichmarks a year to take care of. And that's your money too. And here are children who were born, and really they're taking your money and they're costing the community. So what happened is they started passing laws. It started with a law for the restoration of genetically ill offspring, so eugenics, very similar to exactly what we passed here in Indiana, which, by the way, spread, as we know, from Indiana across the nation and was upheld in 1924 by our Supreme Court. They passed a similar law in 1933. Then we have the law for restoration of German civil service, which then expels Jews and others from holding professor positions in universities and from holding other positions throughout government and other places. Then in 1933, there's a law against overcrowding in schools and universities, which put quotas on the number of Jewish students that can attend. Then we have the Nuremberg laws in 1925, which start to actually use science, that chart that I showed you earlier. They started to say, if you have any unpure blood, any Jewish blood, you're considered Jewish and you no longer have rights. You no longer have civil rights because you are no longer a person. You are less than a person because you are not part of the Volk. That evolved into the concept of worthless eaters. Anyone who is Jewish, disabled, homosexual, a gypsy, they were considered worthless eaters. And then it evolved to life unworthy of life. And ultimately, to the end, the extermination of 6 million Jews and others. So the question you might all be asking is, why did the Nazis target the Jews? This is such a foreign concept that we would target a race, isn't it? Perhaps not. We'll talk about that more. But I think what is actually a foreign concept to us, I really hope, is this concept of life unworthy of life. I do want to take a second and just reflect on how a community can use science, philosophy, and ethics to change the way that they think, to think that humans have no value, that a certain group of humans have no value. So we've come full circle. And now we're going to talk about why we targeted the Jews, is because there's a long history of anti-Semitism going back for millennia. And the theories of why the Nazis persecuted the Jews really had to do a lot with scapegoating and building national unity among a common enemy, i.e. the Jews. So this is a depiction of a famous cartoon that was published widely throughout the Third Reich in Germany that depicts the stab in the back myth, that during World War I, when Germany was bravely fighting, the Jews were using that time to stab the Germans in the back by building wealth and social order that would rule the world. But anti-Semitism was not unique to Germany. During the time that Germany was targeting and the Jewish population, we too in America were saying very terrible things that were racist, not just in the community, but in our medical journals. So from the New England Journal of Medicine in 1900, they have a part of an article was The Insane Jew, where it says the mental strain resulting from excessive zeal in acquiring riches with the consequent worry and annoyance he considers plays no small part in the mental breakdown of these people. That is a stereotype that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine as scientific fact. Also, the common notion as to the length of the nose of a Jew is supported by measurements. 1885, New England Journal of Medicine, the racial characteristics of the Jew. So there is a very common misconception, and that misconception is that Nazis didn't have ethics, when in fact they actually did. And it's a little bit scary because they were actually the very first country in the entire world to require that medical students take a medical ethics course. It was entitled Medical Jurisprudence and the Rules of the Medical Profession. And there was a textbook that was written by Rudolf Ramm. This is a modern day copy of the textbook, which I read. And we'll talk about what's in that textbook. There were, in addition to having medical students have to have ethics education, there was also a requirement for continuing medical education for all physicians. And this requirement for CME was to raise all physicians to the height of medical science and art. Does anyone think that that feels eerily familiar? Anyone? Well, in 1847, when the American Medical Association was founded, its founding mission then and still today is promoting the art and science of medicine and the betterment of public health. And in fact, this textbook opens with a line referring to promoting the art and science of medicine. We had it first, please, just being clear, 1847. So there was a physician leadership school at Alt Reese where it created the entire purpose of this was to create a place where physicians could come to undertake a moral and intellectual renewal. It helped physicians have awakened them the idealism without which the National Socialist physician could not function. They went through purposely and tried to change the moral fabric of what they believed was ethically right. And it wasn't because they forgot the Hippocratic Oath. In fact, they revered hypocrisies. In fact, a quote is, "The Hippocratic Oath and the Indian Oath both testify to the high ethical conception of the medical calling, and that no one should be more revered than the great Hippocrates, because he bound ethics with his greatness and showed virtue to be one of the four fundamental pillars of medicine." Some choice quotes from this textbook, just to show you that you may think that this would be a really scary read. It was scarier to me because of how beautifully written it was. And I don't say that to support them. I'm telling you, if you read this today and I didn't tell you what it was, I fear you may actually want to maybe adopt it in your class. Outside of there's a couple of places where if you pull it out, it really models after what we teach today. That should scare everyone. They say the highest foundation of medicine is love. Good-heartedness, unselfishness, and attention to the welfare of his fellow men were the duty of the medical profession. They had a duty to assist in an emergency to the Volk. And each physician sees his noblest responsibility to be to stand by each individual Volk comrade and also the general community in times of sickness. Here's the problem. When I said that they had to go through that moral and intellectual renewal, it was to change the way that they viewed ethics. It was to degrade individualism in favor of the community. So this is an ultra application of utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. They said the rights over one's individual body of the liberal times were replaced by one's duty of health, which each Volk comrade had to fulfill conscientiously in the interest of the preservation of the whole Volk. You had a moral duty to be healthy for your community. So they recreated ethical standards. We shifted from this pillar, this fundamental ethical mooring that each of you who is listening to this lecture has individual value and worth, to each of you who is listening to this lecture is actually part of a greater community. And it's what's best for the community that we're going to focus on, not what's best for you individually. The other problem is they also started to denigrate people who were Jewish. But the way that it's written in this textbook doesn't sound as scary as one might think. And that's actually what makes me the most scared when I read the book. And I want to point out euthanasia as an example of how you can see this difference between someone who was a member of the Volk, the Aryan race, was treated versus someone who was, for instance, Jewish. The physician is not authorized to shorten a life, even if this would mean release from the unending and unbearable torment in the end stages of sickness. Euthanasia of a member of the Volk was morally, ethically, and legally not acceptable. However, if you are a worthless leader, that was fine because they placed a terrible burden on the Volk community. So this is Dr. Elie Wiesel, who is absolutely phenomenal. He was in a concentration camp. He's a Holocaust survivor. And he said they did not think what they were doing was wrong. They were convinced that what they did was good. I first read that quote about 10 years ago when I was reading his work, and I didn't understand that. I couldn't understand how could they think that what they did was good? But then after going back and studying and learning of this evolution of Darwinism to social Darwinism to eugenics to this fundamental shift in ethics to ultra utilitarianism, I'm starting to see that they entertained an idea and they accepted it without thinking about what the consequences were of accepting that idea to all of humanity. So I now want to talk about the doctors of the Third Reich. And I want to tell you a very harrowing statistic that more than half of physicians in Germany voluntarily joined the Nazi Party. And it was a farther proportion than most other professions. They joined rapidly, they joined in large numbers, and they joined voluntarily. That is very scary. Why would they do that? Well, according to the medical ethics textbook, only a good person could be a doctor. Being a physician requires so much moral and physical strength. You must have been raised to be an honorable, conscientious human being. Physicians were the moral leaders of the Volk. They said in the textbook, only a physician of our time who is a pillar of the Volk comrade can be an intellectual and moral leader of his Volk. So physicians were the fundamental foundation in which the Nazis' entire final solution was built. Physicians had responsibilities to care for the sick, to make life easier for the old and the weak. They also had a responsibility to science and to uphold evidence. But here's where it gets really dark. There was also a legal and ethical duty to report inferior and unfit patients. So physicians under the Third Reich had to report patients who, quote, not just had illness, but also if there is just the suspicion of illness, as well as physical or mental disabilities, hereditary diseases, or behaviors that the regime considered antisocial or racially undesirable. And they say that as old as the science of healing itself is the responsibility of the physician to stand by the sick and weak person during his physical and psychological suffering and to help strengthen him. I agree. Except the next sentence is where it gets really dark. Equally as important from the standpoint of the care of the Volk is the pure preservation of the blood through prevention of the bastardization by bad qualities of foreign racial elements, as well as the responsibility for the protection of the genetic wealth, the preservation and improvement of genetic predispositions, and the complete eradication of the mass of bad genes. Now I want to go through America during the Holocaust quickly. And I actually have no idea what time it is. And I don't want to go over, but all right, let's do this. Okay, so I'm going to start with this quote. To be sure, American physicians are still far from the point of thinking of killing centers, but they have arrived at a danger point in thinking. How did we get to the point where here today, if I had pulled you on your way into this room and I asked you, was America anything like the Nazis? As an American physician during the time of the Third Reich, anything like the Nazis? Was medical profession anything like the Nazis? I'm sure you would resoundingly say, of course not. That was them, that was then. We would never do that. Well, why do you think that? Because of this man, Dr. Ivy. So Dr. Andrew Ivy was the vice president of the University of Illinois, and he was considered an authority on medical ethics. And he acted as the American Medical Association's representative and expert witness at the Nuremberg doctor trials. Dr. Ivy presented what is known as the Green Report during the Nuremberg trials, which was a report where allegedly the governor of Illinois, whose last name was Green, put together a committee of experts to actually study what America was doing in research and whether America actually had research standards. The reason this committee was put together is because at the Nuremberg doctor trials, the Nazis' defense, one of their defenses was, but America's doing it. So the Green Report claimed that the US had longstanding ethical guidelines for human experimentation. False. They claimed that the report claimed that it was written by a committee appointed by the governor of Illinois. That was also false. Dr. Ivy wrote the report and presented it, and after he presented it at the Nuremberg trials, came back and asked the committee to meet and go through the report. So he created the illusion that American research already adhered to strict ethical guidelines and standards, in stark contrast to the Nazis. But this obscured our own ethical failings, something that persists even to this day. I'm going to quickly go through the reality of American medical experiments in the United States. Tuskegee syphilis study, 1932 to 1972, we purposely infected persons with syphilis to see what would happen as they bred throughout generations. This was sponsored by the NIH, and many people died. Guatemala syphilis experiment, same thing, deliberately infected Guatemalan soldiers, prisoners, sex workers, and mental patients with syphilis. MK Ultra was by the CIA, where they dosed unwitting subjects with LSD and other mind-altering substances, along with other psychological manipulations to try to test the concept of mind control. Subjects experienced suffering. We have human radiation experiments. We have the Willowbrook State School hepatitis experiments. The list actually goes on and on. I actually could just do a lecture on American medical experiments that were done. Can you see the dates? 1956 to 1970. When did World War II end? When did Hitler's reign stop? I thought we had ethics standards. Lobotomy. This occurred from 1936 into the 1960s. This was a brain surgery where they would actually insert basically an ice pick into the person's brain, hammer it, and separate their frontal lobe from the rest of their brain. And this was a way that we treated mental illness. The reason Germany actually did acknowledge that lobotomy existed, and they just preferred to exterminate their people with mental illness, and they created the T4 extermination program. Whereas in America, we literally separated people's frontal cortex from the rest of their brain. So I'm going to not go through this, but I'm going to show you that every single law that Nazi Germany passed from 1933 to 1939, America had some type of law or policy that was concurrent. So we talked about eugenics. What were the Jim Crow laws? There were quotas on Jews who could enter Ivy League schools of medicine. There were state sodomy laws. We had institutions on ethics. The American Medical Association excluded Black doctors through state board membership up through the 1960s. We had hospitals access and we had bans on hospital access. Just a quick note on Indianapolis history, given where we are. If you go to Eskenazi Hospital today, the street that it runs on is called Dr. Harvey Middleton Road or Way. He was phenomenal. Dr. Harvey Middleton was a Black doctor who practiced in Indianapolis, and he had to, at the time, Eskenazi was known as City Hospital, he had to be a volunteer because Black doctors were not allowed on the staff, even though he was one of the first people to actually be proficient in echocardiogram, and he studied at Harvard. That is why that street is named after him, because he kept practicing and he volunteered, and he saw Black patients who were forced to be in the basement wards of the hospital. We also had Japanese internment camps from 1942 to 1946 by a presidential executive order, where we rounded up all Japanese Americans and their descendants, and we put them into camps, and we kept them there because it was, quote, for their own safety. But a quote from a person who was actually in one of these camps, internment camps, was, if the camps were intended for our safety, why were the guns pointed towards us? So this gets us back to where we started. To be sure, American physicians are still far from the point of thinking of killing centers. Our internment camps, to be clear, were not the same as the ones that the Nazis had. But we did arrive at a danger point in thinking, and then we swept it under the rug and decided it was just easier not to talk about it. But what stopped us? So American medical ethics before and during the Holocaust, I keep talking about this ethical mooring, this foundation that we have, that every single person has individual worth and value, that there is such a thing as human rights and inherent human dignity. This, although not stated in those words, has been present in our code of ethics since the founding of it in 1847. And in fact, in 1937, a quote from the AMA Medical Code of Ethics is, in a word, it is incumbent on the physician that under all conditions, his bearing towards patients, the public, and fellow practitioners should be characterized by a gentlemanly deportment, and that he consistently should have behaved towards others as he desires them to deal with him. It's the golden rule. But we also have Lockean ethics. What's in our Constitution? That we have the rights to life. That's for us, that's for everyone. We have that fundamental value. We didn't go through a changing in our ethics the way that they did in Nazi Germany. But I will tell you that even though Dr. Ivy did claim that we had upstanding medical ethics, that clearly was not true because after the Holocaust, we passed the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Geneva. The AMA Code of Medical Ethics underwent a major revision in 1958. You have the Declaration of Helsinki and the Belmont Report, and it goes on until now we have entire departments of medical ethics. Thank you for having me here. We have people who work in medical ethics. This is my entire job. So my key thoughts and takeaways. So this is my thoughts that I'm going to share with you. This is what I hope you'll take away today and you'll think about and that you'll actually share with others. I'll start with the closing remarks by Robert H. Jackson at Nuremberg. So this is the prosecutor's closing remarks. Who are the guilty ones? Those who ordered the murder, those who carried it out, those who made money out of it, or those who kept quiet about it. The executioners pleaded orders from above, but the leaders of the Third Reich could remember nothing. We could even add to that America's role. We influenced. We're kind of like the really bad friend that your parents warn you about. So I want to just drill into you the inherent value of medical ethics. Even though we talked about how the Nazis had medical ethics, and so one might say, let's just throw out medical ethics altogether. Clearly it didn't work. That's not what we should do. I do want to point out that science without conscience is the soul's destruction. And in the American Medical Association's Code of Ethics, as well as by some federal laws, physicians have the right to conscientious objection. And I think this is one of the most beautiful ethical principles because it allows physicians to morally object when they are asked to do something that they think is wrong. Now, of course, there are parameters to this. You can't abandon your patients, etc. But the concept of of conscientious objection allows physicians to have some autonomy in what they do. It allows them to say no. And this is very important, especially as physicians are becoming more and more employed and losing their autonomy. They can speak up and they should. Science should inform ethics, not dictate them. I am a research scientist. I understand data. And I will tell you, as someone who understands data, it should not be informing ethics. Data is sometimes wrong. Look at what happened with social Darwinism and eugenics. What about giving every woman of postmenopausal age estrogen? That turned out to be a really bad idea. So data is sometimes wrong. Science is sometimes wrong. They are called scientific theories, not scientific facts, because they're constantly evolving and changing and adapting. And that is why science should inform our ethics, but not dictate how we live our lives and how we practice medicine and how we treat other human beings. I also think that there's a warning about when medicine serves the state instead of the patient who is truly being healed. This is a warning about unchecked state interference in the practice of medicine. A warning which I think today is a very, very important one for everyone to consider and think about. I also want you to consider the dangers of incremental evil. In 1949, the New England Journal of Medicine, I've picked on them a lot, so let me give you a good quote that they had. And I picked on them because they did publish an entire article an entire series of articles where they admitted their own failings, which I thought was incredible. In 1949, in an article entitled Medicine Under Dictatorship, they said, whatever proportions these crimes finally assumed, it became evident to all who investigated them that they started from small beginnings. It was a subtle shift in an attitude of physicians, an attitude of society. It was an acceptance that there's such a thing as life unworthy of life. It was small, it was subtle, and it became humongous and almost ended humanity. So we need ethical safeguards. They are imperative. Do no harm is too simplistic. What is chemotherapy or surgery but harming a patient so that we can ultimately uphold beneficence, which of course is a good thing. So we really need these ethical parameters. Codes of medical ethics are actually essential. And I'm not just telling you guys this because I want to keep my job. I'm telling you this because medical ethics are a beautiful thing. And I never really realized how important these codes are until I started really looking at what happens when we don't have these codes. Of course, there's critics to the codes, and I'm sorry I'm rushing through this. I know we're ending, so I'll take questions on it. But there are critics of the codes. In fact, one of my favorite critics is from 1930, where it was stated in the New England Journal of Medicine, medical ethics are preached largely by those of an older generation unfamiliar with the changing times and customs. Or how about the pluralities of codes of medical ethics are very disgusting to many physicians who are not flattered by the assumption that they do not know how to conduct themselves as gentlemen. New England Journal of Medicine, 1880. I think they missed the point. Codes of ethics provide guidance and they provide safeguards. And I know that there are critics who say, but I read it and I don't understand it. That's okay. The point is to read it, think about it as a whole, and use it as a guideline so that we don't forget our fundamental ethical moorings, which have upheld the practice of medicine and kept us from crossing that line, which we very, very dangerously and closely came to. So I want to tell you that I shouldn't actually be giving this lecture because I never should have been born. So I come from mentally defective ancestry. I come from criminal ancestry. I am Jewish. My grandfather is a Holocaust survivor who was in a camp. I shouldn't be here. I'm also a professor. I probably shouldn't have my job. I'm also a woman. For so many reasons, I shouldn't be here, but I am. And do you know why I'm here? Because I have inherent worth and dignity, and so do you. I don't feel like a guinea pig. I don't feel like a test subject. I don't feel like I am less than any of you. And none of you should ever feel that way about another human being. So I want to end that. I wanted to just press upon you that corrosion begins in microscopic proportions. The shift away from care to cruelty begins with a silent nod. It's silent. It comes slowly. Nobody woke up and said, we're going to commit to the genocide of 6 million Jews and others today. It happened over time. It happened incrementally. People shifted the way they believed. They accepted something and said, okay, that's bad, but you know what? It's not that bad. It'll be okay. And then something else happened and they said, well, that's bad, but it's not that bad. It'll be okay. And on and on and on we went. So I want to end by reading a poem by Martin Niemöller. And it's a famous poem from the Holocaust. And it's called First They Came For. First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. I hope that what you take away from this lecture is a lesson in how close we came in America to crossing that line, to doing unspeakable horrors the way that the Nazis did. Yes, we never got that far, but boy, did we come close. And I am telling you today, we sit in a place where justice might be growing, injustice might be growing. And I ask you, what are you going to do? Will you be silent? Well, I want to thank you for listening to this mentally defective criminal Jew who is just really, really happy to be here with all of you today. So thank you for your time. I think we're going to have questions.
Yes, we are at time, but for those who want to stick around and ask Dr. Comer questions, it sounds like she's willing to do that. So I have the microphone. Just raise your hand. Go right over here.
Dr. Comer, that was an absolutely wonderful lecture. I've asked that question a million times. What made us not go down that path? You're the first person that's ever tried to answer it. I'm not saying you didn't answer it, but there's still some questions in my mind.
Yeah.
And what I worry about the most is that people haven't learned anything. We're recreating the same scenario over again. One thing that I would say you left out was one of the major supporters of the U.S. Nazi Party in the 1920s was a man who made automobiles, a wealthy automobile manufacturer. He was the head of the U.S. Nazi Party.
Right.
Not too dissimilar to some things that we see going on now in this country. what I notice is every generation or every 10 years there's a new hula hoop, a new cure of cancer or neurodegenerative diseases. And we start to address those ethical questions, and we never finish addressing them. So we're now on to AI. We're worried about what the ethical applications of AI are, but we haven't answered the ethical questions that we have about medical genetics, which is
Right.
rapidly advancing faster than AI. So for example, if we know that some schizophrenia is genetically inherited. So if I have a cure for genetic schizophrenia with an adenoviral injection, can you force that person? Can you force that person to take that cure?
These are all fantastic questions and points that you bring up. And in fact, taking them one by one, and I hope I'll hit them all, I did try to answer the question, and it is in some ways unanswerable because I truly, in my heart of hearts, have such a hard time understanding how people could devalue anyone. And I really struggle with that. And as someone who was raised by my grandfather, he helped raise me, lived with me my entire life, and he is a Holocaust survivor. These questions have been in my mind my entire life. I loved my grandpa more than anything in the world, and I just cannot believe that someone treated him the way that they did. And the fact that for so many reasons I shouldn't be standing here, or my daughter who is in the front row shouldn't be here either. And so I think your point is well taken that we constantly go back and repeat the same mistakes. And we have so many unanswered ethical questions. And that is why I have a job. That is why we have departments of bioethics, and we have people who study bioethics, and they incorporate it every single day into everything that they do. And that is actually why I love my job, is because the questions are never answered. I would get intellectually bored if there was always an answer. I wish the answer was we always did the right thing all the time, and then I didn't have a job anymore. That would be great, because then we would be living in a utopian society and I would be very happy. But unfortunately, that is not the case. Life is messy. Situations are messy. You brought up several really good points about ethical challenges. And the answer is always, it depends. It depends on the context. It depends on what's happening. And we have to go through and we have to read our codes of ethics, and we have to remember our ethical mooring. And at the end of the day, the fundamentally most important thing that I hope you all take from this is that every single person has inherent value. And when we forget that, we start going down the path to destruction. And I know that could not fully answer your question, but your answer would be a really great ethics debate. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, I really appreciate you saying that. And I will tell you, I really do fear with AI, data is going to start driving what we consider ethical. And I think we should all be very, very cautious about that. Data should not drive our ethics. It should inform, but not determine. And that is something that I'm really concerned about. And
We've got a few questions online, Amber, if you don't mind. First, we have a question from Van Maui. How can we teach scientific principles like evolution or genetics without opening the door to harmful ideologies like eugenics, which misuse scientific language to justify oppression?
That's a really great question. And as someone who brought their 7-year-old daughter to hear this lecture, I hope I nailed it today. So I think it's that we have to I think the key is we have to admit our own ethical failings. And we have to admit what we did wrong and how close we came, and that we can't just teach eugenics and blow it off as something that someone else did at some other time that we would never do. We did do it. Indiana started it. That's important. Every lecture should start with our own ethical failings and end with a reminder that we are all human and we are all infallible, and that we need to be very careful that we check each other.
Thank you. Do we have any other audience questions?
Mr. Gaffney has a question.
Thank you, great talk. All I was going to say was, speaking as one of the older people in this room, one of the things that worries me the most is what are we not paying attention to now? I think one of the most disturbing pieces is that, including all the stuff you talked about in the US, so Tuskegee and Willowbrook, and the radiation experiments, those all were they were not secret. People like us were reading those in journals like the New England Journal or whatever. And for sure, some people did in fact question, but they went on, Tuskegee went on for 40 years,
Right.
by the US Public Health Service. That should really disturb all of us quite a bit. But my point is now, what is happening that we're not seeing, and that all of us in this room and our esteemed colleagues, et cetera, we all have a responsibility to speak up. Although I think the undercurrent here is that speaking up is going to become probably more problematic and maybe even dangerous. We need to acknowledge our community and the strength of truth.
I love that. And that worries me too. And I'm going to answer your question with a story. There was a community of physicians who fought back against the Nazis. It was the Dutch community, and they said, we're not reporting. We're not turning in our patients. We will not do it. And they didn't. And they came for them, and they killed many physicians. But the physicians who survived took care of the widows and the children of those who fought the good fight. And you know what the outcome was? Is that not a single patient from that community was actually euthanized under the T4 program, because they won. They successfully stood up, but there were people who died. And so the question is, will you speak up? When will you speak up? How will you speak up? And all of that worries me too. And I will tell you, as I prepared this lecture, all I could think, as someone who, again, is a clinical researcher, not just an ethicist, but a clinical research scientist, I thought, oh gosh, in 100 years, who's going to take this picture, put it in their slide and be like, this girl? Wow, what was she thinking? Especially because my area is medical decision making and end of life care. So I deal with a very challenging area. And I wonder every day. But I think that's the thing, is that I don't think people are stopping to wonder enough. And I think that's why the Silvers Lecture, for instance, is so important, because it gives everybody a moment to stop and pause and think. And that's why I'm so grateful each of you came today. And I hope that you will heed Dr. Gaffney's very well said, we'll call it a warning. Any other? Okay.
I'll make a comment to Meg's question. I think one of the most unethical things that we're doing now is the revocation of trials that were being performed by USAID funds. So you had trials in Africa of long-acting antivirals, and people signed up for those trials comparing the long-acting antivirals to standard care. And then all of a sudden, the trial is stopped, which is a direct violation of the Declaration of Helsinki, because once you enroll a person in a clinical trial, you're obligated to continue them in that trial until the trial produces a result. And then you're supposed to tell them what the result of the trial was. And if they were in the inferior treatment arm, then they're supposed to get the superior treatment. So what we're doing is we're condemning people to having viral rebound in a setting of a long tail of antivirals, such that the virus that rebounds is going to be antiretroviral resistant. And so we'll create a whole mass of people who not only have AIDS, they will have untreatable AIDS. And then on top of that is just the suspension of PEPFAR funding to a lot of countries. And now people are like rationing their HIV meds. So instead of taking the meds daily, they take them every 2 or 3 days. And that's how you develop resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to speak out against things of that nature.
I completely agree with you, because what he just described is a threat to the autonomy of the individual, to the health of the individual, the person who enrolled in this clinical trial, and to the community, because we are breeding we're breeding resistant HIV. And that is truly horrific, by the way, that people are doing that. And they are. It does violate the Declaration of Helsinki. And just because we have codes of ethics and we have declarations doesn't mean that people are going to follow them. And we do need to speak up, and we need to figure out, what are we going to do to get people to listen? Because it's not okay. And when are we going to just say it's not okay?
We have a question from Madeline Miller. How do we work as the public to prevent eugenics/human rights issues that are occurring today? For instance, the registry for people with autism that's supposedly being implemented.
So I wasn't going to bring up politics, but since Madeline did, I see a lot of parallels as I was preparing this lecture between things that are happening today, and it scares me. And in fact, when I read that poem at the end, which was from the Holocaust, I actually, in my mind, could change the words to first they came for the immigrants, then they came for those with autism, then they came for the women. If you saw that study, who are they coming for next? It was a little bit scary to get up here and tell you this. In fact, I was told I probably shouldn't tell the entire public that I'm Jewish and the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor, and that I come from mentally defective lineage and from criminal ancestry, because I may become a target. I hope not, but they can come for me, because I'm going to stand up and say, it's not okay. And how do we do it? We do this. We be brave. We take that step. We admit who we are. I shouldn't be here, but I am. I'm saying that to all of you, and I'm putting myself out there, and I may have consequences for that. And that would be unfortunate, but also I really do worry. And so I think each of you needs to say something, do something. Safety in numbers, look at how that's worked. That's better. When everyone's silent, nothing can happen. And perhaps if we all come together and say something, it'll make a difference. Yes, Alan. Do you have a microphone?
First of all, I loved your comment about we need to stand up. Now, I'm going to use an old cliche about the frog in boiling water. And I think in a lot of these cases, things gradually grew. And so I think it's incumbent upon each of us, where is that point where we should stand up and say, no, this is wrong? Well, I think we should grant our peers and everyone around us the right to say, you think it's right, I don't, or vice versa, so that we can address it. I think when you get a bunch of people working on a problem, someone's going to stumble across the right answer. And we have to be smart enough to hear that right answer when it comes. I don't think there were necessarily evil people in part of this processes that you've been discussing, but someone had their blinders on and didn't say, wait a minute, this isn't quite right. It's easy in hindsight to do that. It is much more difficult to do that as the water is starting to warm up. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. This is Alan. He's a former professor retired professor from Purdue and a Navy veteran who brings up some really wonderful points. We absolutely, the frog in boiling water is exactly the point of the incremental evil. I don't think these people started off evil. I think these people started off really thinking that what they were doing was going to help society. And then it slowly got worse and worse and worse because no one said anything. No one stood up. And Alan is absolutely right that we need to have multiple voices. When we shut out our opponents, we lose that voice. And that's something that I will tell you. And I know I keep talking about the American Medical Association's Code of Ethics, but obviously I'm biased. There are other codes of ethics. But I can tell you that the one really beautiful thing about our Code of Ethics is that there is a council who really thinks about these issues and debates and argues them and then writes these opinions. And then it goes in front of the House of Delegates of Medicine, which is comprised of physicians who represent every medical specialty in America. And then they vote on it and they talk about it and they argue it and they debate it and they represent you. And so it is a very thoughtful process that is full of lots of very thoughtful minds. And oftentimes, maybe the ethics aren't exactly how everybody would want them, but we do reach a point of consensus so that we can move forward together in an ethical way. And I think, to Alan's point, it is really hard to know when that point is, that the water's starting to get too hot. And I've been asking myself that every single day for a few months now.
And forgive me, I come from a very long military career. And I like to think I learned a little bit about leadership. And one of the things in all of the units that I eventually learned to do when I had the privilege of leading was listening. Oftentimes, the grunt down in the trenches has a better perspective on what's going on than the general back in the headquarters. And the challenge for the people in the headquarters is to not stifle that feedback, but to provide an environment that encourages that. Now, they used to say, asking the commander a question is like trying to take a drink from a fire hydrant. Because, and I take that as a compliment, there's a time and a place when you're leading someone else that you go back to them and you say, this is why you and I disagreed. And this is what I was seeing. What was it that you saw? And fortunately, a couple of people taught me to say this. Don't tell me, sir, you're wrong. Instead, say, sir, I think there's a better way. And by doing it in that form, by phrasing it in that form, it didn't turn me off. You weren't telling me I was wrong. You were saying you had a better idea. Good. I want to hear your better idea. And so I guess as part of that, when you have those doubts about whatever it is you're doing, whether it's right or wrong or legal or illegal or whatever else, you want to be in an organization that allows you to voice those fears, if you will. I hope they're fears. Okay, I'll shut up.
Professor Ford, I think your point is very well taken. And to that, it is that you want to work for an organization that's going to allow you to speak and not silence you. That you want to work for an organization who's going to allow you to give your own ideas and to tell them when you think they've got it wrong. And when you work for an organization that silences you, I think that's when it leads to moral injury and to burnout. And given that physicians are, in particular, really facing extreme numbers of burnout, now is the time for organizations. I take Professor Ford's comment and I put it back to those who are leaders in healthcare and say, how are you allowing those who work for you to speak up and speak out? And are you listening to them? Or are you silencing them? And I think that same warning can go out, or I should say, a piece of advice can go out to academics. It can go out to everywhere right now in this nation as we're facing some fundamental shifts in what one might even perceive as the nation being asked to change its ethics.
Time for one more question.
So even up to now, we're just playing hot potato. Since the ethical education is being ignored or not spoken up enough, it's having us go backwards. Are we purposely ignoring this education? Is there really never going to be an agreement on treating persons like persons, not an object? Why did these experiments start off on the focus of death? Why is the ethical education not a natural common sense to moving forward?
That's a really wonderful question. Thank you so much for asking. I've tried to explain, this light's right in my eye. I'm gonna go over here. I've tried to explain why people would do that, but I don't really know why. I'm not them. I wasn't there. I can just tell you what their national ethics said. I have the privilege of hindsight. And I think that at this point, that's why ethics education is so important. And in fact, this is one of my students in my class who gives fantastic, thoughtful comments. And I hope that all of you will go through ethics education. In fact, I have to commend the School of Health and Human Sciences here at Indiana University, who is one of the only schools who requires an ethics course for its undergraduates who are going into the healthcare field. That's not required everywhere. And those courses are really important because they challenge you. They challenge you to think about your values. They challenge you to think about others' values. And if done well, they give you an opportunity, as Professor Boyd pointed out, to speak to someone who has a different viewpoint than you and try to maybe come to consensus. And so I think we need to do more in ethics education, not less. Many programs are cutting ethics education, and I think it's a travesty.
Thank you, Dr. Comer, for your presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending in person and online. If we were not able to answer your question, please don't hesitate to either reach out to myself or Dr. Comer, and we'll see you next time.